GIT 500, choosing a design. We talked about research designs in a previous lecture. Now we're going to talk about research approaches. And these are ways to approach how you design your research. There are three main types. There's quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method studies. And with quantitative studies, you're looking for more specific information. It's more explicitly defined as to what data is being requested and pursued. It's also designed to prove proof of reliability and validity more easily because it is asking for specific data that can be examined and analyzed. With qualitative studies, they are really designed to explore, to understand or clarify situations or phenomenons. The desired data outcome is less defined. It's sort of more DIY, do it yourself. And it sometimes requires some back and forth between different design components to get the information that you need, because you're not always sure what you should ask from the get-go on qualitative studies. And then mixed method studies is a mix from both quantitative and qualitative design. Brings in specific data-driven questions as well as exploratory questions. When we talk about quantitative research designs, these are the main research designs under that umbrella: cross-sectional, before and after, longitudinal, retrospective, prospective, experimental, non-experimental, quasi-experimental. We'll talk about most of these. With a cross-sectional, this is where you pick a topic, you identify your population, and if you're using a sample, we'll talk more about that later, and then contact those participants to get data. And there's examples of this is if you want to find out consumer satisfaction with a product, or maybe the attitude of ASU students towards the cost of tuition. This is only done at one time. It's cross-sectional. You hit it once, at one point in time. It's inexpensive because of that, because you're really only making contact once. But because you are only making one contact where you're asking for data, you can't measure anything over time. So you can't see the effects of time on different elements that might affect the change of the data. Before and after is like cross-sectional, except that you are doing it twice. It's sort of like a pre-test and a post-test. You get two sets of data and then you compare those. So an example would be the effect of watching a product's commercial has on a consumer's opinions of that product. So you would get data from them before they watch the commercial, and then you would get data from them after they watch the commercial, and then you compare them. And the great thing about before and after is you can measure time and look at measurements over time, show impacts of different variables, but usually it takes longer, which means it's usually more expensive. You can't always count for extraneous variables that you don't know anything about. And sometimes participants try to improve their answers from the before to the after data collection. Longitudinal is like before and after, but it's done over longer periods of time, and it is used to show specifically changes over time. And usually the study population is visited several times, so data is gotten from the participants multiple times. Examples are the number of emails students receive while attending college, You might check it when they're freshmen, check it when they're sophomore, check it when they're juniors, check it when they're seniors. Very long, right? The types of movies minors watch as they grow up. They get more serious movies as they grow, probably. So this can show that great change over time. You get a lot more data, so it's more accurate. Again, it's more expensive, and participants can suffer what we call a conditioning effect, in that they, each time data is asked of them, they improve their answers to what they think you want them to say. You can look at your design in reference to a time period, a reference period. One way to do it is retrospective. A retrospective design investigates a situation, problem, or issue that has occurred in the past. For example, you might do research on graduation rates of students under the previous university's presidents. You might look at historical analysis of web development of the ASU website in the 2000s. These are things that you would go back and find data and probably gather data as well from people who were around at that time and analyze that. It depends heavily, of course, on the availability of past data, or it's gathered through participant recall, people who were involved. Perspective is the other way. It is studies that look at the likely occurrence of a situation, phenomenon, problem, outcome, or attitude in the future. For example, you might study how to establish the effect of artificial intelligence on future web development designs and technology. How do we use AI in future web development? So the key aspect for that is it tries to predict the future, but of course it relies heavily on speculation and not always on fact. And then you have a retrospective, prospective, which looks at both the past, a situation or a phenomenon in the past, and then studies it into the future. A good example is the effect of the Starbucks program on ASU enrollment in the next 5 years. You could look and see what has happened in the previous 5 years and then extrapolate that possibly into the next 5 years. So a lot of that data will come from existing records, but then you would postulate on what would happen in the future. Another way to look at your research design is what kind of investigation is it? What's the nature of it? So one of them is experimental, and this is just when the researcher controls one or more aspects of the study, such as a before and after study that involves the introduction of an intervention, also known as a variable, to see if it has any effect on the participants. This type of research, experimental research, is associated with quantitative design. Then we have non-experimental, and that's when the researcher doesn't control any variables, i.e. they do a cross-sectional study where they're just looking at a specific variable at a specific time with a specific set of participants, but not introduce any other interventions. And by intervention, I mean a variable, a different variable. And then you have quasi or semi-experimental research. True experimental research uses random selection of participants, but in quasi or semi-experimental research design, the researcher chooses a specific population. As an example, a study about the preferences of students in one of your courses that you take would be quasi-experimental because you are not randomly choosing those participants. So if we were looking at a study of the effect of pass-fail grades on graduate student performance. If we did this as an experimental design, we would probably use a before and after design. We would see what students receive in one session, and then change that grade structure to pass fail for the next section, and then the researcher, you would compare those before and after. Non-experimental, researcher would just observe the change in grades from one session to another, and try to determine if changing the pass-fail grades are the cause of the change. So the experimental depends on a specific before and after data gathering. Letter grades first, and then the after is pass-fail grades. In the non-experimental, the researcher can just look at different classes that one class researched or received letter grades and the other one received pass-fail grades, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the same participants in either way, really, but in the experimental you might want to have the same participants. Some other experimental study designs include, of course, the before and after that we've already talked about. You can't always attribute change to a specific intervention in those cases, but because it might be coincidental, but it is a good way to see if an intervention affects things in one way or another. Having a control group, and that's just means you have an experimental group who receives the intervention or the thing that you introduce, and then a control group that doesn't get that intervention or that variable introduced. And then you compare the groups to show cause and change and cause. But it doesn't always quantify the effects of extraneous variables, which are those variables that you don't know what they are, right? How people feel that day or that kind of thing. And then comparative is also like control group, and it can either be experimental with a control group, like we just talked about, or non-experimental, where you just compare different groups. Nobody gets an intervention, nobody gets a variable change introduced, but you just want to see if they're different. And so maybe you would compare, I don't know, engineering students to GIT students or something like that. Some other quantitative study designs include trend designs, where you look at the past, the current, and what is likely to happen in the future and discuss those trends. And then the cohort studies, where you pick participants based on a common characteristics like age or graduation year, location where they live, that kind of thing. And those are usually cross-sectional, where you get data once, before and after, where you get before and then the intervention and then after, and then longitudinal, where you do that multiple times. All right, so qualitative research design, these are the types of qualitative designs: case studies, oral histories, interviews, participant observation, and then written data analysis. With case studies are a holistic, in-depth exploration of research questions, and it can be focused on individuals or groups, communities, anything that can be sort of corralled and looked at specifically without looking out at other things outside of that person or that group or whatever. Example would be a wayfinding signage in an adult living community case study, where someone goes in, and we've had a student do this, go in and examine the signage in an adult living community to see if it is effective for that population. Another example would be a case study of the evolution of a web development startup company. The key aspects about case studies are that they're open-ended and flexible. They're in-depth rather than broad. They're good for situations where little is known and you really want to dive in and find out more about it. Oral histories are much like case studies, and this is where the researcher collects information about a person or a situation by speaking to people. The researcher records either with an audio recorder or a video recorder or even just by taking notes. And then the researcher interprets the information. They might loop in data from other research to tell a story about that person or those people. An example would be interviewing Ira Fulton about his business experiences, because he has a lot of them. The key aspects about oral histories are that you really get a lot of good in-depth information that you can't really get anywhere else. It's not written down anywhere. And it creates a holistic picture of the topic. Interviews are also can be used as a study design. Interviews, again, can be done individually in a group or like in a focus group. It's a great way to get very detailed information about usually a situation. You could do observations, and that is how getting data about a social interaction or a phenomenon or a task that you want someone to do, such as in a usability testing situation. It can be recorded as descriptive, which would be qualitative, or as data, which is quantitative, having a little checklist that you check off for each person or thing that you observe. You can also get data from written data analysis, and that's like analyzing written data such as a community discussion forum, participants' journals, as well as the researcher, if they keep their own reflective journal. That data can all be analyzed to create a picture in the research write-up. Using mixed methods, many research projects are defined as quantitative studies, but contain some qualitative design elements as well. And that's what we mean by mixed methods design. Examples of this would be collecting data through surveys that use category and scales and through participant observation. Or data is collected through usability testing and participant interviews. And in these examples, the text in maroon is the qualitative elements, and the text in blue are the qualitative elements. So the first one, surveys using categories and scales, is quantitative. Participant observation is a qualitative approach. In this presentation, we talked about quantitative research designs, qualitative research designs, and mixed methods research designs.